What everyday life was like in ancient China before emperors became obsessed with immortality. Hey everyone! Tonight, we're drifting back into a world that feels both familiar and impossibly distant. A world with bustling markets that smelled like warm rice and river mud, quiet villages wrapped in morning mist, and palaces where rulers woke up each morning slightly more anxious than the last. So go ahead and dim the lights. Let your breathing get slow. Get comfortable. Maybe pull a blanket around your shoulders the way ancient palace servants wrapped themselves in soft linen before shuffling down icy hallways to deliver breakfast to a man who had a stressful relationship with destiny. Because tonight, we're wandering gently into ancient China. Not the China of fireworks, silk-robed immortals, or dramatic movie soundtracks. No, we're drifting into the real world behind the legends, the early dynasties, long before emperors began swallowing powdered jade with the same enthusiasm people today have for vitamin gummies. A quieter world still figuring out what kings were for. A world where people were simply trying to survive, while their rulers slowly, steadily developed a lifelong fear of dying. Let's begin somewhere soft, at the edges of the empire, where ordinary people did most of the living, where life actually happened. The villages. When you picture ancient China, you might imagine jade statues, lacquered furniture, and elegant scholars debating philosophy beside koi ponds. Yes, that existed, but almost no one lived like that. The overwhelming majority of people lived in little villages, collections of clay-packed houses arranged like someone had dropped them from the sky and decided, yes, this is a perfect level of organization. Houses were simple, walls made of mud brick thatched roofs, with opinions about leaking floors that were mostly level if you squinted inside. Families slept together on raised platforms heated from below by clay flues. Warm, comfortable, and, depending on how many relatives you shared it with, emotionally complicated. Outside, the village buzzed with animals who wandered freely because fences were optional. Chickens strutted proudly. Dogs barked at shadows. Pigs behaved like they owned the place. And through it all, life felt ordinary, predictable, rhythmic. People rose with the sun, stretched the stiffness from their bones, and stepped out into air that carried the smell of earth, smoke, and whatever someone overcooked last night. It was a life that worked, mostly, except when the river flooded, or when it didn't, or when the tax collectors arrived with numbers that seemed dramatically unrealistic. But still, it was life, food, the daily battle against hunger and boredom. Let's drift into the kitchens, little cooking spaces that served as the heart of the home. Meals were simple. Millet porridge or rice. If you lived somewhere lucky, vegetables boiled into submission. The occasional fish, chicken, or accidental bug oil was precious. Salt, even more so. Flavor was optional. People cooked over smoky fires that left everything, from pots to clothing to eyebrows, lightly seasoned with ash. But there was comfort in it. The warm weight of a bowl of porridge after hours in the fields. Meals weren't glamorous, but they were steady. And in a world where so much depended on weather, politics, and the mood of the person in charge, steady was a kind of luxury. Work, endless, necessary, and performed with quiet determination. Farming wasn't just a job. It was the foundation of the universe. Men plowed fields with wooden tools that broke at the slightest expression of frustration. Women weeded, cooked, cared for children, fed animals, spun thread, and tried not to judge their husbands' questionable attempts at carpentry. Every season carried its own demands. Spring. Plant everything you can. Summer. pray the sky, behaves autumn, harvest fast before something eats it. Winter, repair tools and try not to think about. Spring life was work. Work was life. And resting was something only nobles had the time to do. The beginning of rulers now that we've gently settled into the world of ordinary people. Let's drift, softly, toward the individuals who would eventually complicate everything. The rulers. Early Chinese kings were not gods, not yet, not immortals, not divine dragon men floating above the earth. They were simply men who had climbed to the top of the political ladder and immediately discovered that the top was extremely windy. Being king was stressful. You had enemies. You had responsibilities. You had relatives who believed they were better at your job than you were, and risks were everywhere. A flood? Your fault. A famine? Also your fault. A comet? Definitely your fault. Even though you had no control over astronomy, and probably very mixed feelings about comets in general. The king was responsible for the harmony of the realm, or at least, that's what the people believed. And nothing is more exhausting than being held accountable for the weather. Early court life, a mix of ceremony and low-level. Panic lets step, quietly, into the early royal courts. Imagine a long hall lined with bronze vessels, polished so aggressively they could blind someone on a sunny day. The air smells of incense, silk, and the faint terror of every official hoping they won't be called on to speak. Courtiers performed rituals with the solemnity of people who understood that doing them wrong might end with someone shouting, "This is an omen." Rulers sat upright on wooden thrones, wearing elaborate robes that were stunning to look at and deeply uncomfortable to sit in. Servants moved silently, trained to ignore the royal family's dramatic sighing. And through it all, a strange phenomenon grew quietly. The belief that rulers were not merely leaders, but cosmic anchors. If they behaved correctly, heaven blessed the land. If they behaved poorly, heaven sent a reminder in the form of drought or plague, or an advisor who coughed ominously in court. This cosmic pressure did not lead to healthy coping mechanisms. Philosophers arrive and complicate everything as time passed. Scholars appeared, wandering thinkers dressed in robes, armed with bamboo scrolls, and carrying opinions. Lots of opinions. Confucian. Scholars emphasized morality. Taoist. Thinkers recommended harmony with nature. Legalists suggested strict rules and severe punishments for anyone who breathed incorrectly. Kings listened to all of them and became more confused. Every year, scholars argued about how people should live, how rulers should rule, how the cosmos worked, why humans kept disappointing the gods, whether someone should please open a way. Window ideas spread. Beliefs deepened. Rulers absorbed cosmic anxiety like sponges in silk robes, and slowly, very slowly, a new worry began taking shape. If the king was responsible for maintaining cosmic harmony, what happened when the king died? Who would keep the universe balanced then? This was the question that began to simmer quietly beneath everything, and it would soon grow into something enormous. The first hint of immortality anxiety in these early centuries, kings weren't yet swallowing bizarre potions. Not yet. But they were thinking about death. Often, too often, because death meant the end of their rule waves of political instability. Relatives arguing over the throne, the very real possibility that peasants would revolt in the chaos for rulers who already spent their days worrying about signs from heaven. Death felt like a very rude cosmic inconvenience, and so the earliest seeds of immortality were planted, not through alchemy or magic, but through fear. Fear of losing power. fear of losing harmony, fear of upsetting the universe and having to watch from the afterlife as everything collapsed in a dramatic, frustrating mess. Fear is a powerful motivator, especially for men wearing heavy robes and managing an empire that kept changing its mind about everything. But that is where tonight's drift pauses. For now, the ones who performed rituals at sunrise, the ones who refused to sleep without guards, the ones who believed the cosmos whispered directly into their nightmare, and the ones who first tried to stretch their life. Just a little longer. Not immortality yet, just the beginning of the long, slow slide toward it. Pillows were sacks filled with feathers, or whatever softish material was available. Blankets were thin, scratchy, and not particularly insulating. Yet in those rare, quiet hours, settlers slept deeply, out of exhaustion, not comfort. And when they dreamed, they likely dreamed of home, food, warmth, and maybe a slightly more cooperative continent. A world of hope, hardship, and very persistent optimism despite everything. The cold, the hunger, the strange new diseases, the endless work. The settlers stayed. They stayed because they had hope. They stayed because they had made it this far. They stayed because, despite the discomforts, they believed this land could be shaped into something familiar. And slowly, little by little it was. But that's a story for later. In the next part, we'll drift deeper into colonial politics, the rise of superstition, eerie scandals, fragile alliances, unfortunate leaders, and the settlers' long, complicated journey toward creating a society that would eventually complain about taxes instead of weather. But for now, let your mind drift, like a small canoe on a quiet river at dusk. Imagine living in a village where you knew everyone, every family, every child, every cow, and suddenly half of them were gone. The plague didn't care about wealth, status, or your personal hygiene routine, which, in fairness, was already modest. It swept through towns and cities with terrifying speed. For now, breathe, let your shoulders soften, and drift. Firelight and bone. How the Ice Age cared for its wounded tonight. We're drifting back to a colder, quieter world. A time before kings, before cathedrals, before anyone thought to write down what they were doing, which, as we'll see, might have been for the best. We're heading into the Ice Age, a world of vast plains, slow glaciers, and the occasional startled mammoth. A world where survival was a full-time job, and yet somehow people still found time to look after one another, to heal, to tend, and to hope that the human body could be coaxed back from disaster. So, get comfortable. If you've got a blanket, tuck it around your shoulders. Maybe imagine the sound of distant wind across tundra, and the gentle crackle of a fire made from something you hope isn't mammoth dung. Because tonight, we're asking a question that's both grim and quietly touching. How did people in the Ice Age treat their sick and injured? The first hospitals were fires now. Technically speaking, Ice Age people didn't have hospitals. No sterile beds, no herbal teas that promised to detox your hunter-gatherer body. But they did have one thing that mattered most: community. Firelight wasn't just for warmth. It was a circle of safety. the first primitive ward in the hospital of humanity. If you were injured, bitten, broken, or frostbitten, your best chance at surviving wasn't medicine. It was other people, the ones who'd sit beside you. Keep the fire going and make sure you didn't freeze before morning. And, remarkably, we know they did this. Archaeologists have found Ice Age skeletons with injuries so severe they couldn't possibly have survived without care. Furitoit, shattered leg bone that healed cleanly. A skull with a carefully healed fracture. Even spines that show evidence of congenital disorders. Proof that someone, at some point, kept feeding a person who couldn't hunt or walk. In other words, they didn't just leave their wounded behind, they looked after them, which is, when you think about it, one of the most human things possible. The patient who outlived his odds one of the best examples comes from a cave in northern Iraq, Shanidar Cave. It's famous because that's where we found the remains of several Neanderthals, and one of them, rather affectionately known as Shanidar I, is sort of the Ice Age version of a medical miracle. He lived about 45,000 years ago. By the time he died, he'd already been through more than a few things. His right arm was missing below the elbow, not just injured, but gone. He was also partially blind in one eye, deaf in one ear, and probably had difficulty walking due to a crushed foot. Yet he lived well into middle age. An impressive feat in a world where your average retirement plan was usually being eaten by something with teeth the size of a hand. That means others must have cared for him. They must have helped him eat, move, stay warm, and probably even find meaning in a life that couldn't rely on strength alone. He wasn't abandoned. He was included. And that tiny fact, buried under 40,000 years of dust, suggests that empathy didn't start with civilization. It started with survival. Medicine without medicine when? You picture Ice Age medicine, you might imagine a lot of chanting and rubbing things on wounds. And honestly, you'd be mostly right. There's evidence that some early humans and Neanderthals used natural resources for healing. Plants, clays, even certain stones. In Spain, scientists analyzed dental plaque from Neanderthals who lived over 50,000 years ago. Yes, even they had plaque. Apparently some things never change. Inside that hardened film of fossilized gunk, they found traces of poplar bark, which contains salicylic acid, the same active ingredient as aspirin. So, picture that. A Neanderthal with a toothache or headache. Side of Trishtanayat, sir, chewing on a bitter strip of tree bark, grimacing, but maybe feeling a little better afterward. Primitive, yes, but not stupid. They also used plants with antibiotic properties, like moldy moss and yarrow. And while there's no evidence they knew what bacteria was, they clearly had some instinct for what helped and what didn't, which is more than can be said for about half of medieval Europe. 30,000 years later. Surgery. Sort of one of the most unsettling and impressive Ice Age medical practices was trepanation, the act of drilling or scraping a hole into someone's skull. Now, before you panic, yes, this sounds horrifying. And yes, it was. But it was also strangely effective. Trepanation shows up across the ancient world, but some of the oldest examples come from the late Ice Age. We've found skulls with clean, round holes and signs of bone regrowth, meaning the person survived the procedure. Don't know exactly why they did it, maybe to release evil spirits, maybe to treat head injuries or epilepsy, or maybe someone just thought, well, there's pressure inside. Let's let it out. It's impossible to know. But the precision of the cuts suggests they weren't random experiments. Whoever did it had skill, probably learned from watching, and from surviving their own mistakes. And the tools. Not bronze scalpels or steel saws, just sharpened flint, stone, used to carve bone. Somehow, they managed not to kill their patients immediately, which, if you've ever tried cutting through anything with flint, is practically a miracle. Healing with touch and time. Most care, though, wasn't surgical. It was slow, gentle, repetitive. A broken arm would be splinted with sticks or mammoth tusk fragments, wrapped in hide and left to mend. Wounds were cleaned in streams, perhaps packed with moss or herbs. Fire soot might have been used as a kind of crude antiseptic, and when nothing else worked, they relied on rest, warmth, and prayer, or, more accurately, muttering at the spirits of rocks and animals, which is basically prehistoric prayer. It's easy to forget how much time they had. When your survival depends on the weather, you spend a lot of hours just sitting, tending the fire, sharpening tools, watching a friend's wound heal, slowly, stubbornly, like the thawing of a winter river. And so, out of necessity, early medicine wasn't about speed. It was about patience. The first caregivers, you can almost imagine them. Small groups huddled in caves, sharing warmth and food. Someone tending the fire, someone feeding a child, someone quietly rewrapping a wound. We often think of the Ice Age as brutal, and it was. But even in that brutality, there was tenderness. It's written in their bones, in the healed fractures, the teeth worn down from chewing for others, the evidence that people who couldn't hunt were still being fed. They cared, because without care, there is no survival. Of shamans and spirits. Eventually, some people became specialists, the healers, the shamans. those who dealt with the world's mysteries. Life, death, illness, recovery. If you were in pain, you'd go to them. They'd rattle bones, hum songs, and maybe burn herbs that smelled just slightly less awful than you did. They weren't doctors in the modern sense. They were spiritual negotiators. They spoke to the unseen, to whatever forces might be making your leg hurt or your luck fail. Sometimes that worked. Sometimes you just got lightheaded from the smoke and forgot the pain. Either way, the placebo effect was alive and well. The idea that illness wasn't just physical, but spiritual, is something humans have carried all the way into modern times, though now we call it mind-body connection and charge for workshops. Evidence in the bones if you want a strangely comforting thought. It's this. We know they cared because they left traces of it everywhere. Archaeologists found an Ice Age child buried carefully, wrapped in furs, with beads and tools placed beside them. Someone had taken time to make that death gentle. Others were buried with injuries that had fully healed, which means there was a story before the burial. One of recovery, nursing, and shared endurance. They even buried the disabled and elderly, with the same ceremony as warriors, which tells us that usefulness wasn't the only thing that mattered. Compassion was already in the human toolkit. A quiet kind of bravery. There's something deeply moving about imagining those moments of care. A woman pressing a cloth of softened moss to a man's bleeding side. A child fetching water, shivering but determined. A hunter carrying an injured friend home. Their footprints side by side in the snow. They weren't saints. They weren't philosophers. They were just trying to make it through winter. But somewhere between the broken bones and the mended ones, between the sickness and the recovery, humanity took root. They didn't just fight nature. They fought to keep each other alive. The fragile miracle of survival. Every healed fracture from that erases a story of community. Every scar, a lesson in improvisation. The Ice Age didn't allow weakness, and yet somehow people survived even when they were weak. Which means they learned something we still forget sometimes. That caring for others isn't just kindness. It's strategy. We made it through the cold because someone, somewhere, decided that one more life was worth the effort. And in that dim, smoky firelight, medicine was born. Soft pause. Let's drift a little further forward in time to see what happened when that quiet instinct took Kermit new challenges. When the glaciers melted, villages grew, and the world warmed just enough for humanity to start experimenting with herbs, rituals, and mistakes that would eventually lead to medicine as we know it. But for now, Imagine the glow of that first fire, a flicker of hope against the endless cold. The afterlife of royal mistresses tonight. We're drifting back to the soft candlelight of royal courts, where perfume, gossip, and power mixed like expensive poison. You might know their names, the royal mistresses, those glamorous, scandalous women who reigned beside kings without ever wearing a crown. They lived in silks and secrets, watched their lovers rule kingdoms, and learned, sometimes the hard way, that affection from a monarch comes with an expiration date. Because what happened after the king died was rarely as romantic as the paintings suggest. When the crown passed to someone new, so did the bedchamber, the titles, and the affection. Mistresses who once held the ear of Europe's most powerful men often found themselves holding eviction notices instead. So tonight, let's wander gently through their fates. From the graceful survivors who reinvented themselves, to the tragic figures who faded into exile, and the occasional opportunist who outlived everyone. Settle in, dim the lights, and let's drift into a world of powdered faces, whispered alliances, and the delicate art of staying relevant when the king no longer breathes. A life built on borrowed time. Being a royal mistress was, in theory, an enviable position. You had wealth, jewelry, and usually your own apartments. You dined with nobles who pretended to respect you, and sometimes even influenced national policy, usually while wearing something embroidered with your initials. But the role came with a problem baked in. It only lasted as long as the king did. Royal mistresses were a bit like monarch butterflies. Beautiful, admired, and completely dependent on one particular ecosystem. Once that disappeared, so did they. Of course, some managed the transition better than others. Let's start with one of the most famous examples, the woman who turned being a mistress into an art form. Madame de Pompadour. Madame de Pompadour, the mistress who outlasted her title Jeanne Antoinette Poisson. Yes, her last name literally means fish, which doesn't sound promising for a woman of elegance, was born in 1721 to a family of ambitious financiers. By her 20s, she was already dazzling Paris, smart, charming, with just enough flirtation to disarm a king. She met Louis XV, the beloved, who, ironically, was not beloved by anyone who actually knew him. Jeanne became his mistress in 1745, and, unlike most, she didn't fade away after the first scandal. She reinvented herself over and over again. When the romantic side of their relationship cooled, she became his closest confidant. She read to him, organized his social calendar, and managed diplomatic correspondence while pretending it was all just casual pillow talk. And when she began to age, a death sentence for most mistresses, she adapted again, transforming into a kind of royal event, planner/best friend. By the time Louis XV died, she had already secured her future. She was granted a noble title, a house of her own, and the rare privilege of being remembered with affection. Even Voltaire admired her intellect. And really, when Voltaire compliments you, you've won 18th century France, but Madame de Pompadour was the exception. Most royal mistresses were not so fortunate. Let's drift to her successor, a woman who found out just how fast the royal sun can set. Madame du Barry, the mistress who lost her head, if Pompadour, was the polished diplomat Jeanne Bécu, later known as Madame du Barry, was the scandal made flesh. She came from a far humbler background, illegitimate, clever, and making a living however one could make a living in mid-18th century France. Eventually, she found her way into high society by way of jewelry, charm, and a nobleman who needed a distraction. By 1768, she had caught the eye of the aging Louis XV. She was stunning, funny, and, according to every surviving account, utterly bored by politics. Courtiers despised her. She couldn't read Latin, she forgot names, and she had an unfortunate tendency to giggle during solemn events. But the king adored her. He gave her diamonds, gowns, and influence, the three main nutrients of royal life. Then, in 1774, Louis XV died. Overnight, Madame du Barry went from the most powerful woman in France to that awkward reminder of Grandpa's private life. The new king, Louis XVI, and his very proper wife, Marie Antoinette, didn't want her anywhere near Versailles. Du Barry was quietly exiled to a convent, which was less about repentance and more about getting her out of the royal line of sight. She eventually returned to her estate, lived quietly, collected art, and then, unfortunately, the French Revolution arrived. In 1793, her connection to the old regime caught up with her. She was arrested, and after a perfunctory trial, guillotined. Her final words to the executioner were almost childlike. "Please, monsieur, not so fast." It was a rare moment of honesty in a time when everyone else was pretending to be brave. From royal favor to real estate problems. For many royal mistresses, exile was the standard post-mortem package. After the king died, the court simply moved on. The new monarch usually had his own political circle and his own preferences. Mistresses from the previous reign were often politely, or not so politely, asked to leave. They'd retreat to country estates, write long sentimental letters, and try to pretend that they'd chosen peace and privacy over public life. Catherine Tilney Long, one of George IV's early flings, ended up surrounded by unpaid bills and servants who vanished faster than her credit. Even the formidable Barbara Villiers, Mistress to England's Charles II, spent her later years in debt and scandal, trading jewels for groceries, and quarreling with her own children about who had inherited her father's good looks and her mother's temper. Royal favor made you rich overnight, but it also made you dangerously dependent. And when that favor disappeared, so did the furniture. The English tradition, polite hypocrisy in England. The role of royal mistress was often treated with a sort of national shrug. Everyone knew it happened. No one liked to talk about it. Charles II had so many mistresses that keeping track of them was practically a full-time government department. He once joked that they cost less than a war, though historians have since done the math and discovered this was absolutely false. His most famous lover, Nell Gwynn, was a former orange seller and actress. She was cheerful, witty, and entirely uninterested in politics. Her charm came from her honesty. She never pretended to be anything but what she was. Even after Charles's death, she remained surprisingly well treated. The next king, James II, paid her debts and protected her son. She died quietly, in relative comfort, a rare ending for someone who'd once been the most talked-about woman in London. But not every mistress found such peace. Louise de Querouaille, another of Charles's favorites, was despised as the French whore, a phrase the British press, even then, used with all the subtlety of a hammer. After Charles died, she returned to France, where she lived for decades in fading luxury, writing letters about how much she missed England's weather, which is possibly the saddest sentence in history. The quiet ones who survived not. All mistresses ended in exile or disgrace. Some were pragmatic enough to secure their future long before their lovers' funerals. Agnes Sorel, mistress to Charles VII of France, was perhaps the first to make the role official. She wore diamonds at court, advised the king on military campaigns, and convinced him to take Joan of Arc seriously. When she died suddenly at 28, possibly from mercury poisoning, the king buried her in a cathedral, a shocking honor for a mistress. Centuries later, her successors took note. The clever ones invested in property, secured pensions, and quietly married minor nobles to anchor themselves socially. They knew the secret truth of the position. You could survive losing a king, but not losing your income. The long fade into respectability by the 19th century, the role of royal mistress was becoming awkward. Modern politics demanded moral virtue, and newspapers loved a scandal. Monarchs still had affairs. Of course, they just got better at pretending otherwise. Edward VII, the future king of Britain, had an impressive record of mistresses, most notably Lily Langtry and Alice Keppel. Lily became a celebrity in her own right, starring on stage and investing her money wisely. Alice Keppel, charming, discreet, and apparently soothing to Edward's chronic indigestion, remained in royal favor even after his death. Her descendants would go on to include one Camilla Parker Bowles, proof that history, like fashion, never truly goes out of style. The unwritten rules being a royal mistress was never an official job, but it came with unspoken expectations. Don't get political unless you're clever. Don't get emotional unless it's flattering. And above all, never outshine the Queen in public. Those who broke the rules usually learned fast. Henriette d'Entragues, mistress to Henry IV of France, once demanded he make their son legitimate. He refused, and she spent the rest of her life writing bitter letters about how unfair men were. Catherine Howard, one of Henry VIII's less fortunate wives, started as a mistress and ended on the scaffold. Anne Boleyn, too, proof that in Tudor England, being the king's favorite could elevate or destroy you, depending on which week it was. As the centuries drifted on, royal mistresses faded from the spotlight. Marriage became the proper stage for romance, and politics moved to parliaments instead of bedrooms, and the first whispers of what would become the modern obsession with being spotless. The surprisingly clean history of a dirty world tonight. We're drifting back through time to answer a question you probably don't want to think too hard about before bed. How did people actually clean themselves before soap existed? Now, I know what you're imagining. Grimy peasants, mud-caked knights, and nobles who smelled like damp velvet and regret. It's a familiar picture. The filthy Middle Ages, where everyone stank and disease lurked behind every unwashed curtain. But as with most things in history, the truth is weirder, softer, and more surprising. Because while, yes, people were often dirty by modern standards, they also spent a remarkable amount of time trying not to be. They just had different ideas about what clean meant. So go ahead, dim the lights, get comfortable, and maybe appreciate your shower a little more. Because tonight, we're going to gently float through the history of hygiene, from ancient oil scrapers to medieval bathhouses, from powdered wigs to perfumed filth, and along the way, we'll meet emperors, monks, and medieval hypochondriacs who all shared one simple, eternal question: how do I stop smelling like death and onions? The first humans who tried to feel clean. Let's start far back, before soap, before baths, before anyone even thought of bathing as a pleasant hobby. Early humans probably cleaned themselves the way most animals do, with water when it was available, and a bit of scratching and rubbing when it wasn't. It's not glamorous, but it worked. When you're covered in mammoth fur and optimism, personal scent isn't your top priority. Still, there's archaeological evidence from Paleolithic sites showing that people did value cleanliness, at least symbolically. They scraped their skin with flint tools, possibly to remove grime or parasites. They smeared clay and ash on their bodies, which sounds odd, but it actually absorbs oil and odor. Essentially, prehistoric dry shampoo. Fast forward a few thousand years, and cleanliness starts to take on a social meaning. The Egyptians, as usual, were overachievers. They bathed daily, sometimes twice a day, using a mixture of animal fats and alkaline salts called natron. It's the same stuff they used to embalm mummies. So, yes, the ancient Egyptians cleaned themselves with what was, technically, a mild corpse preservative. They shaved their entire bodies, too, not for beauty, but to avoid lice and the general indignity of insects. Priests, especially, had to be spotless, both for ritual purity and to avoid the sort of plague that might interrupt a perfectly good prayer session. The Greeks, buff, bathing, and olive oil. The ancient Greeks took Egyptian cleanliness and made it aesthetic. Bathing became a social art form. They'd strip down, slather themselves in olive oil, then scrape it off with a curved metal tool called a strigil. This removed dirt, sweat, and, well, most of the top layer of skin afterward. They'd dust themselves with fine powders to make the skin gleam under sunlight. So if you ever wondered why all those Greek statues look flawless, it's not Photoshop. It's exfoliation. Public baths were common, but so were private wash rituals at home. Water was sacred, connected to purity and balance. And unlike in later centuries, no one thought bathing was dangerous. It was practically divine. The Romans, when hygiene became an industry, and then came the Romans, because of course they took one look at Greek bath culture and said, yes, but let's make it bigger. Roman baths were colossal, complete with hot rooms, cold plunges, steam chambers, and occasionally snack bars. Imagine a modern-day spa crossed with a sports bar and just a hint of mild nudity. Soap, at this point, still didn't really exist. Instead, Romans used oil and scrapers like the Greeks, but they did experiment with soap-like substances, mixing animal fat with ashes, creating a rudimentary form of what we'd later call soap. Interestingly, early Roman soap wasn't for skin. It was mostly used to clean cloth and hair. Not the kind of stuff you'd want near your eyes. Public bathing wasn't just about hygiene. It was a statement of citizenship, leisure, and empire. To be Roman was to be clean, or at least cleaner than the barbarians, who were thought to wallow in filth and superstition. Naturally, the irony here is that once the empire fell, Europe would spend the next 1,000 years being accused of smelling like exactly that. Early medieval hygiene. Less filthy than you think now, Let's drift into the so-called Dark Ages, where people are said to have forgotten how to bathe. It's not entirely true. They didn't forget bathing. They just changed the rules. In early medieval Europe, cleanliness became moral rather than physical. The Church taught that the soul mattered more than the body, and too much concern with bathing was suspicious. You didn't want to look vain, or worse, French. Still, plenty of medieval people did wash, not daily perhaps, but often enough to be recognizable as human. Records show that peasants bathed in rivers during summer, and nobles had wooden tubs hauled to their chambers. There's even a charming 15th century illustration of a couple sharing a hot bath, complete with floating herbs, towels, and wine. So, not exactly the cesspool of filth we imagine. They used what they called lye soap, made from ash, lime, and animal fat. Essentially, early detergent. It worked, but it was harsh. The kind of soap that left your hands cleaner and your soul slightly scorched. People also used cloths soaked in rosewater or vinegar to wipe their faces. Monks had strict washing routines. Some bathed weekly, others only on holy days, which, if you think about it, was probably not often enough for shared cloisters. Still, the idea that no one bathed at all is mostly myth. Medieval people liked smelling pleasant. They just used different tools. The bathhouses. Medieval Europe's wet secret by the 13th century. Bathhouses were booming. Every major town had one, sometimes several. They weren't just for cleaning, but also for gossip, food, and yes, a bit of extracurricular socializing. Men and women sometimes bathed together, which caused predictable outrage among priests and predictable curiosity among everyone else. Bathhouses offered warm water, herbs, sponges, and even towels, a luxury item at the time. You could order a meal, drink wine, and float in warm, steamy comfort, while pretending you weren't basically in the Middle Ages' answer to a nightclub. Then, of course, came the plague, and naturally, they made it worse. Doctors began to believe that hot water opened the pores and let in disease-bearing vapors. Public bathing fell out of favor, and clean skin became associated with risk. If you didn't bathe, you weren't dirty. You were simply protecting yourself from death. It was one of history's great hygienic backslides, and it stuck around for centuries. The Renaissance, powdered perfume, and controlled decay. By the time of the Renaissance, people were still washing, just not as frequently, and rarely with soap. Instead, they relied on linen. Changing your shirt daily was considered as good as bathing. The logic was that linen absorbed sweat and dirt, so wearing fresh underclothes meant you were, technically, clean. It was dry cleaning for the human body. Perfume became the new hygiene. courtiers carried pomanders, tiny silver balls filled with herbs or ambergris to ward off unpleasant odors and equally unpleasant diseases. Queen Elizabeth, I reportedly bathed once a month, whether she needed it or not, which sounds horrifying to us, but in her time, that was practically spay-level dedication. Her father, Henry VIII, had a private bathroom at Hampton Court with running water and a bathtub lined in velvet, which, one imagines, didn't stay very clean for long. But the point was comfort, not sanitation. They didn't yet understand germs. They just knew that bad smells were suspicious, and good smells were close to godliness. The rise of real soap as we know it, the bubbly, gentle kind, finally came into its own in the 17th and 18th centuries. It was still made from fat and lye, but better refined, often scented with lavender or herbs. In France, the city of Marseille became famous for its olive oil soap. It was so gentle you could wash silk with it. By contrast, England's soap was harsher, industrial, practical, and taxed heavily by the government. So heavily, in fact, that many people made their own in secret. Illegal soap, a concept both ridiculous and perfectly British. As cleanliness became fashionable again, so did the bath. Wealthy homes had copper tubs filled by servants, while the poor managed with basins and sponges. But the general mood was shifting. Cleanliness was now a sign of morality, industry, and progress. The Enlightenment brought an explosion of health manuals urging people to bathe for vitality and to stop fearing their own skin. And so, little by little, Europe began to smell slightly less like cabbage and incense. The oddly persistent myths. Before we drift further, it's worth pausing on a few myths. No, medieval people didn't all think bathing was sinful. No, the average peasant wasn't a walking cloud of disease. And yes, people cleaned their teeth, using twigs, ashes, or mint leaves. They even plucked body hair, though the tools looked distressingly sharp. The main difference between then and now is that they didn't equate clean with sterile. To be clean was to be fresh, perfumed and spiritually pure, not microbially disinfected, which is probably for the best, since they had no idea what microbes were. Let's drift next into the age of powdered wigs, where people smelled like violets and vinegar. We'll wade gently into the 17th and 18th centuries, a world of perfumed nobles, royal bathhouses, the quiet lives of medieval executioners tonight. We're drifting back to a quieter corner of the Middle Ages, a place where the streets smell faintly of tallow. The air hums with gossip, and somewhere near the edge of town, usually next to the gallows, a man sharpens a blade that everyone pretends not to see. We're talking about medieval executioners. Those grim, hooded figures we imagine in woodcuts and bad Halloween costumes. But tonight's story isn't about the act of killing. Not really. It's about what they did the rest of the time, when there wasn't anyone to hang, behead, or burn. Because, contrary to popular imagination, most days in the life of an executioner were perfectly ordinary. Boring. Even, they were men who had to feed their families, buy bread, and fix leaky roofs. They lived in houses, drank beer, and got yelled at by their wives, though, to be fair, probably with more reason than most. So let's dim the lights, settle under a blanket, and drift back to a world of blood, bureaucracy, and unexpected domesticity. Because the life of a medieval executioner was less horror movie and more awkward small-town sitcom, the job nobody wanted executioners didn't exactly apply for the position. It wasn't posted on a notice board. Now hiring must be comfortable with decapitation. In fact, it was usually a punishment. A thief or criminal might be offered a grim deal. Take up the axe, or lose your head to it. Many executioners were former outlaws. They'd been spared execution themselves, only to become the hand of it. The irony didn't go unnoticed, but then again, irony was basically medieval Europe's hobby. Cities needed someone to do the dirty work, and very few respectable citizens were volunteering to dismember anyone. So, the role became hereditary. The son of the executioner often had no choice but to follow his father's blade, which makes family dinners sound interesting. Imagine being told, "One day, son, all of this," gestures vaguely toward a blood-stained block, "will be yours." By the late Middle Ages, executioners had settled into their role as a social necessity. They were vital and completely despised. The outcasts' executioners lived at the edges, both literally and socially. Their homes were usually just beyond the city gates, near the gallows hill or execution field. It kept the smell and the moral discomfort at a safe distance from polite society. In Nuremberg, for instance, the executioner's house was tucked beside the river, with a special door for undesirable traffic. In France, they called it the Maison du Bourreau, a house everyone knew about, but no one visited. Executioners were banned from entering churches. They couldn't join guilds, marry honorable citizens, or even shop freely at the market. When they did, merchants sometimes dropped goods into their hands rather than risk brushing their skin. They were seen as ritually unclean, a necessary evil with a pulse. But here's where things get weird. Despite being hated, they were also oddly fascinating. People whispered about their knowledge of anatomy, their supposed magical powers, and their rumored ability to cure disease, because yes, executioners doubled as healers. the healer with the axe. When your job involves dismembering people for a living, you tend to learn a thing or two about the human body. Executioners were often the only ones in town with hands-on experience in anatomy, quite literally. So, between jobs, they moonlighted as informal surgeons. They treated wounds, set bones, and sold potions, made from rather questionable ingredients. There's a record from 16th century Germany of an executioner named Franz Schmidt, a surprisingly well-documented and strangely gentle man. Schmidt kept a diary of every execution and every medical treatment he performed. Over 40 years, he executed 361 people and healed hundreds more. His medical patients included people who would have refused to shake his hand in public. But when your leg's hanging off, you tend to overlook social stigma. The same hands that cut rope from a condemned man's neck could also remove a tumor, apply leeches, or mix a salve for burns. There's even evidence of people believing that executioners possessed healing blood. Bits of rope used in hangings, and even the ashes of burned criminals were sold as talismans or remedies. It's grim, but people in the past had a remarkable ability to turn horror into homeopathy. Making ends meet executions didn't happen every day. Even in the most lawless towns, you could only behead so many people per week. So executioners needed side hustles. They often worked as knackers, disposing of dead animals, cleaning carcasses, tanning hides, basically any job that involved death and was too disgusting for anyone else. In some places, they ran public bathhouses. Sounds odd until you realize that bathhouse work also involved physical cleaning and hot water, a kind of civic sanitation. The executioner's bathhouse might have been the only place where an ordinary citizen could share a tub with someone both feared and necessary. Others brewed beer or distilled spirits. If you lived on the edge of town with access to firewood and water, you could make a decent living selling ale. And nobody was going to argue with the man holding the axe. There were even executioners who became minor celebrities. Their skill with the sword was legendary, and crowds came to watch a clean, efficient beheading. A badly done execution, say, one that took 3 swings, was considered deeply embarrassing. So a good executioner had professional pride. They trained, they practiced, they sharpened meticulously, because reputation was everything. And public failure was the only thing worse than public disgust. The family business executioner families often formed their own tiny social networks. Since they couldn't marry into normal society, they married each other. Executioner daughters wed executioner sons, and the profession became a closed caste. In 17th century Germany, the Reindl, Schmidt, and Rosenfeld families were famous dynasties of executioners. Their children were educated, sometimes surprisingly well. Franz Schmidt, our diary-writing friend, taught his own children Latin and mathematics. He hoped they'd eventually escape the profession, which, unfortunately, was harder than escaping public prejudice. Children of executioners were barred from many trades. Even if they tried to become tailors or bakers, guilds refused them membership. They were tainted by association, as if decapitation were hereditary. So, generation after generation, they stayed in the shadows. And yet, within their small circles, executioners developed a strange, cohesive culture. They supported each other, shared techniques, and even had their own patron saints, because of course they did. The patron saints of awkward professions in Catholic Europe. Hier tudi fidi dirtno, there was a saint for everything, from blacksmiths to beekeepers to people suffering from gout. Executioners, lacking moral clarity, gravitated toward saints like Saint Dismas, the good thief crucified beside Jesus, and Saint Julian the Hospitaller, a man who accidentally murdered his parents and spent the rest of his life caring for strangers. It's hard not to see the connection. Executioners lived lives of punishment and service. They did the ugly work society needed, then begged forgiveness for doing it. In a way, their whole existence was an act of penance. The strange privileges of the profession, despite their outcast status. Executioners enjoyed some unique perks. They often lived rent-free, their houses maintained by the town. They received free firewood, free food at inns, and the occasional thank-you barrel of wine, though probably not from the condemned. More bizarrely, they had the right to claim certain items from the bodies of executed criminals, clothing, coins, or even, disturbingly, body parts. Some of these were sold as relics or charms. A finger bone from a hanged thief might be used as a lucky charm by gamblers, because nothing says good fortune like someone else's knuckle. Executioners also ran what we might now call true crime tourism. People came to the gallows field to buy souvenirs, drink ale, and watch justice served. A medieval public spectacle that was part punishment, part entertainment. So even when they weren't killing, executioners were part of a thriving little economy built around death and curiosity. Their reputation in death, ironically, many executioners died better deaths than their victims. Franz Schmidt, the Nuremberg executioner, was eventually pardoned and granted citizenship, a rare honor after decades of service. He retired comfortably, living long enough to see himself transformed from outcast to respected medical man. Others weren't so lucky. Some were murdered by mobs or executed themselves when regimes changed. The public had short memories and long grudges, and yet, centuries later, Historians now view these men with something like compassion. They were products of their time, trapped between fear and necessity. They lived among death, but often behaved with more humanity than the crowds who jeered them. And bathing became a strange, luxurious form of performance art, because cleanliness by then wasn't just hygiene, it was fashion. Let's drift now, a little deeper into their private worlds, because beyond the work and the blood, executioners had families, homes, and small domestic lives. Meals shared under candlelight, wives who stitched shirts with steady hands, and children who wondered what their fathers really did all day. In the next part, we'll wander into those quiet domestic spaces to see what the butcher of the town was like when he hung up his hood and sat down for supper. The quiet madness of the Middle Ages. Tonight, we're drifting back to a time before therapy, before padded rooms or diagnoses, or even the faintest idea that the brain was something you could study rather than simply pray over. We're going back to the Middle Ages, that long, dim stretch of history where madness could make you a saint or a prisoner, sometimes both. So find a quiet spot. Let your shoulders relax. Maybe a blanket, maybe a candle, something soft nearby, because tonight's story isn't loud or terrifying. It's just quietly strange. The story of how medieval people lost their minds and what the rest of society thought that meant. Let's start gently with a picture. Imagine a medieval town. Maybe France, maybe England, somewhere damp and perpetually gray. The streets are narrow, and they smell faintly of wet hay, smoke, and humanity. In the marketplace, a woman is standing on a cart, shouting things that make no sense to anyone but her. Her hair's undone, her hands flutter like frightened birds. People stop to stare. Some think she's cursed. Some think she's been touched by God. And a few, very quietly, wonder if she's contagious. Because madness, in the medieval imagination, was both terrifying and divine. It was a crack in reality that let other forces in, angels, demons, ghosts, or something less defined. And in a world where science had not yet separated the body from the soul, there was no such thing as mental illness. There was only possession, or grace. Where madness came from. The medieval mind didn't really have a single explanation for insanity. Instead, there was a kind of buffet of causes to choose from, depending on how rich you were, how sinful you'd been, and what kind of story people liked to tell about you. If you were poor and started acting strangely, it was probably the devil. If you were noble and started acting strangely, it might be melancholia. And if you were a monk and started hearing voices, it could be divine ecstasy. It was all a matter of interpretation and politics. The Church's official stance was that madness, like most human suffering, was the result of sin, a punishment, or at least a lesson, sent by God. But physicians, yes, they existed. Though most were guessing, were starting to form their own ideas. Drawing from the ancient Greek theory of the four humors, they believed madness came from an imbalance in the body's fluids. Too much black bile made you melancholy. Too much yellow bile made you angry. Too much blood made you overexcited. Basically, the brain was a kind of bubbling soup, and you just had to get the seasoning right. Treatment might involve bloodletting, purging, baths in milk, a diet of lettuce, or the occasional whiff of lavender if you were fancy. If you were less fancy, they'd just chain you up for a while until you calmed down. And somehow, both approaches seemed reasonable at the time. The holy mad now. Medieval Europe did something rather strange with madness. It sometimes treated it as holiness in disguise. There were, for instance, the fools for Christ. People who wandered around naked, shouting riddles or prophecies, claiming divine visions. In the Byzantine Empire and later Russia, these figures were treated with an odd mix of reverence and fear. They could insult the emperor in public, and no one dared punish them because, well, what if God was speaking through them? And then there were the mystics, mostly women. Interestingly enough, women like Marjorie Kempe in England, who spent years weeping loudly in church, seeing visions of Jesus, and generally alarming everyone within earshot. By today's standards, she might have been suffering from something like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, but to her contemporaries, she was either a living saint or a blasphemous nuisance, depending on who you asked. And this is the tricky thing about medieval madness. The same symptoms that got one person locked up could make another famous. It depended entirely on how you framed it and who you were. A peasant woman hearing voices, possessed, a noble woman hearing voices, chosen by God. Social class, it seems, could determine whether your hallucinations were holy or heretical, when the body was to blame. Of course, not everyone bought the supernatural explanation. By the late Middle Ages, a few physicians started to suggest that madness might actually live in the brain, not the soul. They were still wrong, just differently. One 13th century text advised checking the patient's urine for corrupt vapors. Another recommended burning rosemary and holding it under the nose to expel demons through scent. Some suggested the moon had a direct influence, hence the word lunatic, because naturally, if someone was acting strange, the obvious culprit was a glowing rock 238,000 miles away. But, to be fair, the moon theory wasn't entirely ridiculous. People noticed that certain behaviors waxed and waned like the lunar cycle. It just took about 700 more years to figure out that serotonin, and sleep had something to do with it. Madness as entertainment. And then there's the uncomfortable truth. Medieval society often found madness entertaining. By the 14th and 15th centuries, cities like London and Paris had informal madhouses, some run by hospitals, others just by opportunists with spare basements. People could pay a small fee to come and look at the inmates, who were often chained, half-naked, and filthy. Most notorious of these was Bethlehem, hospital in London, better known as Bedlam. It started as a small religious hospice and eventually became the byword for chaos itself. Visitors described it as both horrifying and fascinating. The poor patients, raving or sobbing, became living exhibits for the curious. If you're imagining a grim, candle-lit scene of iron chains and straw, you're not wrong. But what's most unsettling is how normal it seemed to people at the time. Madness wasn't treated as tragedy. It was spectacle. Of course, this wasn't unique to Europe. In some Islamic cities like Cairo and Baghdad, hospitals did care for the mentally ill with surprisingly humane methods like music therapy, baths, and gentle restraint. But those ideas rarely reached Christian Europe, which was too busy diagnosing demons. Demons everywhere. Speaking of which, demons were the all-purpose explanation for anything the church couldn't otherwise explain. If you were hearing voices, seeing visions, or simply acting a bit too happy during Lent, it could mean something unholy was whispering in your ear. Exorcisms were common, and not the dramatic, Hollywood kind, just long repetitive prayers in Latin, maybe a sprinkle of holy water, and, if things got serious, a little light beating to encourage the demon to move out. One monk wrote that he cured a woman's madness by locking her in a dark cell and reading psalms over her until she came to her senses, which sounds suspiciously like sensory deprivation therapy, mixed with a lot of chanting. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the patient died. But either way, the church called it progress. The dancing plague every so often, madness stopped being an individual problem and became contagious. In 1374, in the Rhine Valley, entire towns began to dance, men, women, and children, hundreds at a time, convulsing, spinning, and leaping through the streets for days without stopping. Some collapsed from exhaustion. Others kept moving until they died. No one knew why. The priests called it divine punishment. Doctors called it choreomania, which is Latin for dancing like an idiot. Modern historians think it might have been mass hysteria, or possibly a reaction to ergoty, poisoning from moldy rye bread. But in the 14th century, people saw something simpler. The world had gone mad together. And perhaps, in a strange way, that was comforting, because if everyone's insane, then no one really is. Saints, sinners, and the thin line between them, it's hard to overstate just how blurry the boundaries were between mental illness, sin, and sanctity. The same monastery could house both a holy visionary and a deranged prisoner. And sometimes they were the same person at different times of day. There's a recorded case of a nun in 15th century Italy who spent years claiming to have visions of angels. Her confessor believed her until she started saying the angels were angry at the Pope, at which point she was declared possessed instead of blessed. Diagnosis, it seems, depended heavily on politics. If your revelations supported the Church, you were divinely inspired. If they didn't, you were insane. Everyday madness most of the time, though. Medieval insanity was quieter. It wasn't dramatic or demonic, just ordinary people slowly falling apart under the weight of famine, war, or grief. There were no therapists, no concept of trauma. If your entire family died of plague and you started talking to shadows, people would pity you, perhaps feed you, perhaps not. There are heartbreaking court records of madmen wandering naked in winter, or mothers hiding dead infants because they couldn't bear to let go. Some were locked up, some were left alone, and a few, like the woman who claimed to see her dead husband at the edge of her field, were quietly tolerated, because everyone, in their own way, was a little mad back then. Life was short, brutal, and confusing, and in that kind of world, a little madness wasn't surprising. Across cultures, across centuries, people have always wanted to hold time in their hands, to own a piece of eternity, even if it meant desecrating it. Let's drift slowly to the next part of our story. We've seen how medieval people explained insanity through demons, humors, and divine visions. But what was it like to live that way? To be declared mad in a world that didn't quite know what that meant? The silence. After the palace gates closed tonight, we're drifting back to a quieter corner of history, somewhere between the ruins of empires and the whispers of court corridors. You might want to dim the lights for this one. Get comfortable, maybe a blanket, because we're spending the night with some of the most overlooked people in imperial history, people who held enormous power, and yet left behind almost nothing of themselves. We're talking about the eunuchs, those strange, tragic, and sometimes terrifying figures who managed palaces, whispered into royal ears, and sometimes decided the fate of entire empires, without ever being considered quite human enough to be remembered properly. And the question that drifts through tonight's story is a simple one. What happened to them after the empires they served collapsed? When the palace gates closed for the last time, when their emperors were overthrown or their dynasties forgotten, what became of the men who had no heirs, No families, and often no place in the world outside the walls they once ruled from the shadows. Let's start, softly, in the marble corridors of Byzantium. The imperial eunuchs of Byzantium, the Byzantine Empire, was, among other things, a place that absolutely adored complicated hierarchies. If you could put something in a chart, Byzantium would. And if you couldn't, they'd probably invent a new type of official just to make it fit. Eunuchs were one of those categories that fit neatly into Byzantine logic. Not men, not quite slaves, but not free either. They existed in a shimmering gray zone of servitude and privilege. Many were taken as boys, captured, bought, or given up by poor families hoping their sons might rise through the palace ranks. The operation was brutal, but it opened doors that would otherwise have stayed locked forever. In a world where noble blood was everything, being bloodless in a literal sense could, paradoxically, make you trusted. A eunuch couldn't start a dynasty. He couldn't father a rival. He could, in theory, devote himself entirely to the emperor. And so they did. For centuries, Byzantine eunuchs handled the delicate machinery of empire. They were chamberlains, generals, diplomats, bishops, even regents. One, named Joseph Bringas, essentially ran the empire under the dull but glittering rule of Emperor Romanos II. Another, the famously ambitious Basil Lecapenos, known charmingly as the Parakoimomenos, meaning the one who sleeps beside the emperor, was effectively the puppet, master of the court. He wasn't technically allowed to have heirs, but power, it seems, can be inherited without blood. The end of Byzantium then came 1453. Constantinople fell to the Ottomans, and the Byzantine world simply ended. For everyone else, there was at least something to cling to. Families fled, monks preserved texts, nobles reinvented themselves as minor Italian princes. But for the eunuchs, men whose entire existence was tied to the palace, there was nowhere to go. When Mehmed XVI, 800 soldiers broke through the Theodosian walls, the imperial eunuchs were among the last to stand guard in the crumbling palace. Some tried to defend the empress. Others were captured and quietly folded into Ottoman service. After all, the Ottomans had eunuchs too. A few disappeared into monasteries, hoping perhaps that a life of prayer would give some meaning to what was left of them, but most simply vanish from the record. Their names, their faces, their voices, gone. A silence that's almost fitting for a class of men who had lived in service, half seen and half remembered. Let's drift eastward to another empire of palaces and courtyards, one that lasted longer and had even more eunuchs. The Chinese palace system, China's imperial courts, especially during the Ming and Qing dynasties, had an almost industrial-scale system of eunuch service. At their height, There were perhaps 70,000 eunuchs in the Forbidden City. 70,000. The numbers alone sound absurd, like a bureaucratic fantasy. But they were real. Every aspect of court life was run through them. Laundry, libraries, espionage, and yes, the emperor's personal entertainment schedule. They were both indispensable and deeply distrusted. A eunuch could be promoted to Grand Director of the Inner Court one day, and executed for corruption the next, because, of course, the one thing emperors hated more than rivals was their servants becoming too powerful. Zheng He, the eunuch admiral, if there was a golden age for eunuchs, it was under the Ming, and the brightest, strangest star among them was Zheng He, born in Yunnan, captured as a child, and castrated before puberty. Zheng He somehow became the Grand Admiral of the Chinese Navy. He commanded fleets of ships so large that when Europeans first heard of them, they assumed the reports were exaggerated myths. They weren't. Zheng He sailed to India, Arabia, and the coast of Africa, leaving behind porcelain, diplomats, and the faint echo of imperial ambition. He was a eunuch, yes, but also the face of China's brief flirtation with global power long before the age of exploration. And when he died, somewhere around 1433, the great fleets were recalled, the shipyards dismantled, and the eunuchs blamed for the empire's extravagance. The bureaucrats won, as they always did, and the eunuchs, once again, retreated into the shadows. When the Ming fell now, if you've ever seen an empire collapse in slow motion, you'll know it's rarely graceful. By the late 1600s, the Ming dynasty was unraveling under the weight of corruption, famine, and rebels. Eunuchs, unsurprisingly, were accused of ruining everything. They were said to have siphoned off taxes, manipulated emperors, and even sold palace secrets to foreign traders, all of which, in fairness, some of them did. When Beijing finally fell in 1644, the last Ming emperor, Chongzhen, hanged himself from a tree behind the Forbidden City. The eunuchs who had served him, the men who had spent their entire lives tending to his robes, writing his letters, guarding his chambers, suddenly found themselves unemployed. Some tried to pledge loyalty to the new Qing rulers. Some were executed as symbols of Ming decadence. And others, left with no home or purpose, wandered into poverty. A few even formed secret brotherhoods and religious sects, half desperate, half defiant, keeping alive the memory of a world that no longer existed. Imagine spending your life in service to the Dragon Throne, and ending up as a beggar outside its gates. That was the fate of many. The Ottomans, masters of the harem. Let's drift softly now toward Istanbul. The Ottomans perfected the use of eunuchs in ways that would make even the Byzantines blush. Their empire was vast, and its palace life intricate to the point of madness. At the center of it all sat the Topkapi Palace, and at the center of that, the imperial harem. It wasn't quite the scandalous fantasy Western travelers like to imagine. The harem was less an orgy and more a government department, one that required constant management, and managing it were the eunuchs. Specifically, two rival factions. The white eunuchs, who guarded the outer palace, and the black eunuchs, who guarded the harem itself. The chief of the latter, the Kuzlar Ayasu, wielded extraordinary power. He controlled access to the Sultan's family, oversaw religious endowments, and often had more political influence than viziers. He was, in many ways, the most powerful man in the empire who technically wasn't a man. When empires fade, but the Ottoman Empire, like all the rest, eventually began to fade. By the 19th century, European envoys wrote sneering reports about decadent palace life and corrupt eunuchs. Reformers began to view them as embarrassing relics. Modernity demanded parliaments, railways, and constitutional law, not men in embroidered robes keeping watch over silken curtains. As the sultans themselves lost power, so did their eunuchs. The last Kuzlar Ayasu, a man named Hacı Beşir Aga, was quietly pensioned off when the caliphate was abolished in the 1920s. After that, nothing. No new eunuchs were made. The survivors, many elderly by then, lived out their days in small apartments in Istanbul, their entire world reduced from the grandeur of Topkapi to a rented room with fading carpets and a radio. Some of them became minor celebrities, giving interviews to curious Western journalists. They'd describe, with a strange mix of pride and bitterness, what it had been like to live inside the palace walls, untouchable and forgotten all at once. And when they died, they left behind no children, no diaries, no dynasties, just a handful of names on fading gravestones. But for centuries, these women were the hidden engines of power, the soft voices that whispered into royal ears, the artists of survival in courts, where affection could be a weapon. Some died disgraced. Some died rich. A few, like Madame de Pompadour, managed to turn love into legacy, and all of them, in one way or another, proved that proximity to power is both intoxicating and fatal. And yet, there's something darkly human about that impulse. Let's drift, now, to their quieter afterlives, to the letters they left behind, the estates they tried to manage, and the ways they were remembered, or conveniently forgotten, by the courts that once adored them. Let's pause here, just for a moment. We've drifted from Byzantium to Beijing, and from there to Istanbul, 3 empires, 3 kinds of silence. In the next part, we'll explore what it felt like to live that kind of life. Half powerful, half ghost, We'll wander through their daily routines, their strange little privileges, and the quiet sadness of people who existed entirely for others. So, when you're ready, let's drift on to part 2. Life behind the silk screens. The strange afterlife of the ancient dead tonight. We're drifting back to a time when mummies weren't kept behind velvet ropes in air-conditioned galleries, but stuffed into ships' holds, sold by the pound, and occasionally snorted by the upper classes. So, if you're ready, dim the lights. Get comfortable. Maybe a cup of tea. Maybe something darker. Because tonight's story is about the very long, very strange journey of what people did with mummies before museums existed. The rediscovery. That wasn't really a discovery. It's tempting to imagine that the Western world rediscovered Egypt with Napoleon's campaign in 1798. All pyramids, sand, and trumpets. But the truth is, Europe had known about mummies for centuries. They just didn't really know what they were. The first European traders to encounter them, back in the Middle Ages, looked at the black, resin-coated bodies pulled from Egyptian tombs and thought naturally, medicine. Because why not? The word mummy itself actually comes from the Persian mumia, meaning bitumen, that thick, tarry substance used in embalming. People in the medieval Islamic world were already using mumia as a healing resin, scraping it from ancient corpses and mixing it into salves. It was thought to cure everything from bruises to plague. When European merchants started bringing it west, apothecaries just kept the idea going for nearly 500 years. If you walked into a respectable pharmacy in Paris or London, you could buy powdered mummy. It was usually sold in little jars, mixed with honey, and recommended for headaches, stomach issues, or, if you believed the advertising, general despair. Mummy medicine, the health craze that shouldn't have been by the 1500s, mummy medicine had become the kind of pan-European wellness trend Gwyneth Paltrow could only dream of. Royal physicians prescribed it to kings, queens, and anyone wealthy enough to afford it. Francis I of France reportedly carried powdered mummy in a pouch wherever he went, to be swallowed in case of injury. Because, apparently, nothing heals a sword wound like a pinch of 4,000-year-old human remains. The logic, such as it was, came from the old idea of sympathetic medicine. If a body had been preserved from decay, perhaps its essence could preserve yours too. A little death to ward off more death. The practice got so profitable that demand far exceeded supply. Soon, unscrupulous dealers in Egypt began faking mummies altogether. Baking recently deceased peasants in ovens, smearing them with tar, and selling them to European traders. You might say, Mummy medicine was not always ethically sourced. When art got involved, but medicine was just the start. Because once you have a thriving trade in human remains, someone inevitably decides to get creative. By the 17th and 18th centuries, artists had discovered that ground mummy, mixed with white pitch and myrrh, made an unusually rich brown pigment. It was called mummy brown. Painters loved it. It had a soft, luminous tone, somewhere between shadow and sepia. Turner used it. So did Delacroix. Even the pre-Raphaelites dabbled in it, though they later claimed regret. One London colour merchant in the 1800s proudly advertised that his pigment was genuine mummy. When a shocked artist asked whether he truly meant human mummy, the dealer smiled and said, "Oh yes, but we've run low. The supply depends on fresh arrivals from Cairo." Eventually, the ethical crisis set in. By the late 19th century, one paint company held a mock funeral for its last tube of mummy brown, burying it in the garden behind their shop. It was, arguably, the only dignified burial some of those mummies ever received. The mummy as curiosity. But before we get to funerals for paint, let's drift back a little to the Renaissance, when curiosity was a kind of religion. Collectors across Europe were obsessed with gathering the strange and the ancient. They built cabinets of curiosity, rooms or chests filled with shells, minerals, taxidermy, shrunken heads, and, naturally, mummies. A real mummy was the crown jewel of any collection. The older, darker, and more desiccated it looked, the better. They weren't preserved out of reverence. Mind you, they were conversation pieces. People would invite guests over, pull out a coffin, and casually remark, "This one's from Thebes, around the time of Moses." Mummies became a kind of cultural shorthand for the exotic and the ancient. To own one was to display your learning, or, at least, your disposable income. Even Shakespeare got in on the trend. In Othello, he mentions the Arabian trees dropping their medicinal gum, a sly reference to mumia, the prized resin scraped from embalmed corpses. By the time he wrote that, mummy powder was already so commonplace that everyone in the audience would have known exactly what he meant, unwrapping the dead fast forward to the 18th and 19th centuries. Europe had entered the age of archaeology, or at least something vaguely pretending to be archaeology. Egypt, freshly opened to Western travel after Napoleon's campaign, became the obsession of the age. But with every ship that sailed home from Alexandria came more mummies. So many, in fact, that customs officers began complaining about the smell. What do you do when ancient corpses are piling up in your ports? If you're a Victorian, apparently you throw a party. Mummy unwrapping, Parties became one of the strangest social entertainments of the 1800s. Guests, dressed in evening finery, would gather in candle-lit drawing rooms to watch as some amateur Egyptologist carefully sliced through ancient linen, layer by layer. The wrappings came off, revealing amulets, jewelry, and, eventually, a leathery face staring up at the ceiling. Sometimes the mummies were genuine royal burials. Sometimes they were the embalmed bodies of temple attendants or children. It rarely mattered. People applauded, made notes, occasionally fainted. And when the show was over, the remains were quietly discarded or given away as souvenirs. A London newspaper in 1850 described the events as educational spectacles of the highest order, which is one way of saying mass desecration, but make it classy. Why the obsession? It's easy to sneer at all this now, but the fascination wasn't entirely malicious. Egypt seemed eternal. To Victorians trapped in the smoke and speed of industrial life, it represented something ancient and unchanging. Mummies were tangible proof that humans could defeat time, or at least delay it. They were the embodiment of immortality, wrapped up and sold wholesale. And, of course, there was also simple colonial arrogance. Europeans felt entitled to Egypt's past, as if ancient history were just waiting to be distributed. Among their parlors and museums, one British traveler wrote proudly that he'd bought a fine specimen of mummy to display beside his grandfather's portrait. He thought of it as a nice generational touch. When mummies became cargo by the mid-19th century, the trade had reached industrial scale. In Egypt, entire tombs were emptied not for study, but for export. Mummies were stacked like timber, bundled in cloth, and shipped down the Nile. Some were ground up for fertilizer, the nitrogen-rich remains of ancient Egyptians scattered over European fields. Others were burned as fuel. An American newspaper in the 1850s described Egyptian entrepreneurs selling mummies by the ton to rail companies for use in steam engines. Apparently, they burned quite well. One traveler claimed he could tell when the train was burning. Mummies, because the smoke smelled particularly aromatic. Whether that story is true or apocryphal, no one's quite sure. But it feels true, which is sometimes worse. Egyptomania and the birth of the souvenir by the late 1800s. Tourism in Egypt had become fashionable. Steamships carried wealthy Europeans up the Nile, where they could dine beside the pyramids and haggle over antiquities with local dealers. Mummy parts became the ultimate souvenir. A finger, an amulet, perhaps a strip of linen, something you could wrap in tissue paper and show your friends back in Bath or Berlin. Egyptian officials tried, occasionally, to regulate the trade, but by then there was too much money in it. Every tomb raider, every desert guide, Every customs clerk had a price. The country was being quietly dismantled, bone by bone. When science finally arrived, it wasn't until the late 19th century that archaeology began to resemble something like a real science. Scholars like Flinders Petrie and Gaston Maspero started insisting on proper excavations, cataloging, and preservation. Museums, suddenly aware of how much had already been destroyed, began hoarding what was left. The same Europeans who had spent centuries grinding, painting, and burning mummies now decided they were precious cultural artifacts. The irony was almost tender. Still, by the early 20th century, mummies finally had a new home: glass cases, clean labels, and a little bit of dignity. People still stared, but now they did so quietly, reverently, and without dessert wine. The echo of all that dust. You visit a museum today and stand before a mummy. Under the soft hum of climate control and low lighting, it's hard not to. Think about how many others didn't make it here. The nameless bodies powdered into medicine, the artist's pigments, the unwrapped corpses that entertained Victorian guests for an evening and were then thrown away. The truth is, for most of their posthumous history, mummies weren't relics of awe. They were commodities, objects to be consumed, quite literally. Let's drift softly now into the next part. We've seen what people did with mummies: powdered them, painted with them, paraded them. But why did they keep doing it, even after realizing how wrong it was?